You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Alice Lagnado. Earlier this month, Prime Minister David Cameron called for the adoption process to be speeded up. The government wants to streamline both the fostering and adoption processes, which they say take too long. Cameron also says that he wants to change what he called the absurd barriers to mixed-race adoption, which he says trap many non-white children in care. To shed some light on the issue of adoption in the UK, with me in the studio are Gareth Crossman, Director of External Affairs for the fostering and adoption charity TACT, Sue Kent, Professional Officer at the British Association of Social Workers, Cecile Tresenar, who runs the International Adoption Guide, a comprehensive resource for people who want to adopt from outside the UK, and joining us by phone is Jabir Butt, Deputy Chief Executive of the Race Equality Foundation. I'd like to begin by looking at the issue of speed in all adoptions and to ask you, Gareth, whether you agree that the adoption process in this country should be accelerated.
I think there's certainly merit in the government saying we need to look at the adoption process. Where our concern lies is in the tone that they're using to describe the debate, which is saying, well, if we sort out interracial adoption, then that's the adoption system sorted. So that is one part of a very complex debate. But certainly, as in any system, you can look at it and you can look at room for improvement.
Cecile, what's your view?
Well, I think a lot of improvement can be made on just competence. I'm an adoptive parent, and my whole home study was riddled with incompetence, which took months and months and months. Things like...
Can you just, Cecile, explain to listeners what a home study is? Because not everyone is familiar with the term.
Okay, so home study is when you assess to see if you'll make a suitable potential adoptive parent, and it's a social worker who comes to your house over a period of time, roughly about 6 to 9 months, and interviews you and your family members a couple of times for a couple of hours every 3 or 4 weeks, so about 9 to 12 times. So, and then they basically put the papers together. But we had things like documents that weren't signed. I had one of my documents were left in the in-tray at the post office because nobody could go to the post office to post it. That was 2 months.
And Cecile, you tried going through the UK adoption process, and in the end, were you accepted?
No, I was turned down on an ethnic issue because my father was Dutch and my mother was English, and they would only match me with a half Dutch, half English child, of which there weren't any in the care system.
And so you ended up adopting from another country, Russia, didn't you?
I did, and that was several years later, and that was from another motivation when I did this, realise how many children in Russia and around the world, basically, who need adopting, and I followed that route. Sue,
what do you think of Cameron's idea that adoptions should be accelerated?
I think that we have to recognise that it's not just, I'm from the British Association of Social Workers, it's not just social workers in this, and we were very anxious that the message that came across from Cameron actually associated that to our profession, so we were concerned about that. I wanted to say that first of all. Obviously we are anxious that, as with Gareth says, any review of procedures etc. is welcomed. I do really worry about the way this is going ahead and how the government's pushing forward in line with spending reviews and the lack of resources and money to provide the necessary backup to make sure this is in place. So I welcome the review and I welcome some of the aspects, but I'm extremely concerned about how that's going to be put in place.
Why should the process be speeded up in the first place? Are there issues with the adoption process taking a lot of time? And when he's talking about a lot of time, are we talking months or years?
I think we have to get this into proportion, really, because I think we've got 65,000 children that are looked after at the moment, and there's only something like 6% who actually would be suitable for adoption. So we're looking at a much smaller figure. When we look at permanence, it includes all sorts of different aspects besides adoption, and this is what worries us, that the conversation, I'm sure Gareth will back this up, is today with the government is focusing on one aspect of a child's life. And there are so many children out there who are suitably placed with long-term foster carers, who with family. There are a multitude of aspects. I know we're talking about adoption today, but again, that's important to remember.
This really goes to the heart of the debate, because I think the government has absolutely focused on adoption as being the gold standard for children in care, is that ideally we would like to adopt more children. Now, we agree that more children should be adopted, but as he said, the majority of children in care, adoption is not suitable. I mean, a lot of that is to do with the fact that people's idea of children coming into the care system or being adopted is that it's babies going in. In fact, children come into care a lot older, often with siblings. What we're very much keen to do is to place this debate about adoption in a much wider context about what is the best outcome for children in care. It's not about adoption or fostering, it's about stability.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia. This is Alice Lagnado, and with me today are Gareth Crossman, Director of External Affairs for the fostering and adoption charity TACT, Sue Kent, Professional Officer at the British Association of Social Workers, Cecile Treysenar, who runs the International Adoption Guide, and Jabir Butt, Deputy Chief Executive of the Race Equality Foundation. I'd like to ask Jabir Butt on the line his opinion about what Gareth has just said. Jabir?
I'm really pleased to be here. I feared that I was going to be coming along and disagreeing with a lot of what was being said, but actually I agree with much of what has been said. We have a politically driven debate at the moment which seems to be focusing on the ethnicity of children and whether or not it's contributing to delays in their adoption. Whereas actually the situation is much more complex, and as Gareth and others have pointed out, there are a whole series of issues to be addressed, not least of which is that what we need to do is what's best for the children, and this seems to have been completely lost in the debate at the moment because it has been politicised.
Well, I think I disagree, because I think what they're doing at the moment is it has been so complicated. It is so complicated, nobody knows what's going on. There's all these different arguments, and they're taking a clear line right through the middle and saying, what is the best outcome for a lot of children is adoption. We need to get these children out of the care system into permanent, stable homes with families that they're going to live with for the rest of their lives, and a normal life as possible. And I welcome that.
But the reality is that something like 20% of adoptions break down. For many children at the moment, adoption isn't an option because of various reasons. They're not very attractive to prospective adopters.
Sue, you wanted to say something?
Busting here to say that, the statistics for placement breakdowns, for adoption placement breakdowns, the research is very poor. We know that 1 in 5, that's a piece of national research, 1 in 3 in a piece of Welsh research breaks down. There are lots of reasons for that, and I'm sure Cecilia will come in on that.
With our organisation, with the Russian UK adoptions, we have 204 members, and I think it's about 180 children. And so far, we haven't had one disruption. One
of the striking features of the debates, particularly the political debate, has been the regularity with which people quote an anecdote rather than real evidence. And a lot of the material that's been used to suggest that black and minority ethnic children are waiting longer seems to be derived from that. If you look back at the statistical evidence, black children have been waiting longer for at least the last 40 years. And strangely enough, the statistical evidence today seems to suggest that the pattern is very similar. Yet we now blame it on same-race placement policies, whereas 40 years ago there was no such thing as same-race placement policies. There were many people at that time who actually seemed to think that it was actually good for black children to be placed with white families under some notion that this encouraged integration. So we've got to be very careful when we come across with small-scale studies or anecdote as to what has happened in a particular situation. The evidence has been very consistent and demonstrates that it's very little to do with same-race placement.
Gareth?
Race is one aspect. It's an important aspect. It's one aspect of trying to find the right adoption in the way that, there are various things that you look for. as an adoption agency, we are keen to recruit people from black minority ethnic groups because we know that if we can get a good match, then that's a positive thing. But we're also happy to and frequently do have children placed for adoption with different ethnicities. I mean, in London, you look at London, you walk along the street, you see how many people of multiple heritages you're going to see walking along. The idea of getting some sort of perfect match for every child that comes in is not just. It's just not practical. But the other thing I wanted to say was that we're talking about the complexity of the debate, and I just want to highlight one aspect of it to maybe give an idea about why delays can occur. Now, contrary to what a lot of people think, nearly all the children who are placed for adoption have been in the care system. It's likely that they would have experienced abuse or neglect, at the very least chaos in their lives. There's a very good chance they may be permanently damaged. It's vital for that adoption to work that proper post-adoption support services are placed, because people think you're adopted and that's it, you go off into the sunset as a happy family. The reality is these are damaged children. Now, we know that some of our own families put off seeking a final adoption order because they're totally unhappy with the package of post-adoption support that's been offered by the local authority. This isn't universal. I'm just saying it's one type of thing that can easily happen, because they know that while that child is in the care system, they will have entitlements to support. They're going to disappear once they're adopted. So this is, why it's so important, why it's so frustrating to just pick up the papers and just say it's about race, it's about PC social workers, when the reality is a hugely complex issue. And unfortunately, money is part of that. So
parents aren't getting enough support on the other side, you're saying?
Post-adoption support is really needs to be lifted up. Just on one point that's interesting, what I've noticed between the domestic and inter-country adoption thing, the domestic adoption, there's always the consideration that the child is damaged and will be damaged forever.
Yeah.
And with the inter-country adoption thinking is the child was damaged, they had a poor start in life, and things can improve and they will get better. And that is the philosophy between the two, which I find really fascinating.
They're both correct. They can be much improved, but they've got to. But the reality is, some children, because children are born with their brain 1/3 developed, between the ages of 0 and 3, nearly all the rest of that brain development takes place. If they're neglected, their brain will not have developed. So a good family and love can absolutely transform their life, but the fact is that child might be permanently damaged.
Well, that is why the speed is so important, to get the children into permanent placings before that crucial 36 months.
It's quite interesting to come in there and say that, for an example, social workers, we've had the economic situation is affecting the services greatly. Somebody rang me the other day, they're an adoption support worker, they were supporting 60 children in adoption who need support, and then they were working for a third sector, a charity, who had contracts from the local authority, had them cut in this next financial year, and so she had her hours reduced, and she was still expected to cover that many cases. I mean, this is the sort of situation we're in, and how on earth can 60 families have that sort of support? And this is in a London borough. It's really difficult. I can't stress how difficult it is that we have the government suggesting change, but we don't have the resources, we don't have the social workers.
So it's all very well for them to talk about changes, but if they don't give you the backup in terms of money or adopting parents after they've adopted.
Absolutely.
I still want to get back to the original thing, though, about why black children, for example, might not be adopted by white families. It seems to me there must have been some good reasons for this originally.
Yeah. I mean, of course, there were, and it's quite interesting. I can give a case as a social worker I worked on, and just of interest, I met a 14-year-old from Asian background, and she had attempted suicide, and she was adopted by white carers, and she really didn't know who she was. She had no idea. She went to a predominantly middle-class white school, lived in a white area. She actually wanted to be Afro-Caribbean, and she had a really, really big identity crisis. Now, I'm talking 15 years ago, and she'd been adopted from the age of 2, and she had learning difficulties as well. And the resources then, in those days, I was able to put her in line with a consultant who was appropriate to her ethnicity and give her some identity. But it was long-term work, expensive work, and I would question question now today whether a social worker would be able to utilise that.
There are so many possibilities of resources being available, except nobody knows where to put their hands on it.
Can I just ask Jabir his view on that point? I just wondered, Jabir, whether you have any examples as well from your work, like Sue has from hers.
All children have questions around their identity as they grow up. It's a common part of growing up, trying to discover who you are, where you belong, who you belong with. I think, however, that one of the issues is about trying to develop a sense that due attention is paid to ethnicity. Not that it's paramount, not that that's the only thing taken into account, but due attention is paid. And I think this is what's been lost in this debate. It's been politically driven. It's not paid attention to some of the points that have been made today. For example, the cutting resources that are available. This is going on across the country at the moment.
Can I just? I mean, you can't predict what's going to happen in the future, but I think there is a risk that if the government starts pushing this "it's about race" line and sending out very strong messages to social workers, they always talk about the strong messages that have to be sent out, that if they do that too much, then you could actually end up with a very dangerous situation where social workers feel very much pressurised into basically just getting it done as quickly as possible, almost avoiding looking for an ethnic match because they're being told you've got to discount ethnic matching. Now, when you speak to people about this, most people actually agree that race is a factor, but it's one of several factors, and you don't get much of disagreement on that. When you speak to people from government, they say the same thing, but it's not about what you say when you're having an enlightened debate around the table. It's about the message that's been given out, and the message being given out to the public and to the social work profession is that you have to avoid looking for racial matching.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Alice Lagnado. I did also want to ask, though, what's going to be worse for a child? I suppose you can't make a blanket decision, have a blanket view on this, but what are the life chances of children who spend all their childhood in care, Gareth?
Well, very good, actually. Outcomes for children in care are not good overall. But we know from TACT zone research into the children that are placed in our care, we know that if they are given love, if they are given stability in a long-term foster care placement, and our foster carers, when we recruit them, we make it very clear to them, they are expected to treat the children placed with them as if they were their own children. That's non-negotiable. There is no reason, and we have evidence to show, that children placed in long-term fostering placements, so they have the permanence of knowing that they are going to be with this family until they leave care, will achieve just as highly in education, have just as good a chance of finding employment, have just the same life chances, get to do the same things that children have fun, enjoy their childhood. We're so obsessed with what's the right type of outcome for children. We forget about if that works for a child, then it's not about placing them in an order and a hierarchy.
Cecile, I think you wanted to say something there because you have views on this.
On permanent long-term foster care. But unfortunately, the average child in the UK has been in several foster care situations where the child is put into the foster care, taken out, put back with the parent, put back with the foster child, put back with the parent. So it's where that urge to maintain and keep with the family, which is obviously a very, very important thing, but there has to be a decision that's made at a certain point before that that this child is not in a healthy situation, and a better long-term foster or adoption care would serve them better.
Yeah, and that's right. And I mean, for some children, actually, short-term foster care is the right thing to happen for them. But you are absolutely right. There is no doubt, not just what you're talking about, children shuttling backwards and forwards out of care, but children being moved around from foster family to foster family. For the government will always say this isn't the case. The local authorities can't say it's the case, but for financial reasons, because they're looking for the cheapest outcome. But that's not to say that fostering, there's anything wrong with the idea of fostering. That is to say that, as we're saying with the adoption system, it is an imperfect system, but you don't say that system's wrong, it shouldn't happen. You just say there are definite flaws in the system that need to be addressed.
I think going back to your start about where this all came from, we had a change in legislation in 1989 Children Act, which really is central to all our work and says very strongly you should listen to the children's wishes and feelings. And we forget this sometimes. We forget that this is about children. Often they're older, they're able to express opinions and feelings. A lot of the work and delay sometimes that leads to adoption adoption is sibling issues, about contact, families, aunties, grandparents, all this stuff. It has to be assessed sufficiently to ensure that that child, their needs and what they want, etc., is met. And the delays in adoption processes, there are legal delays. I think Gareth probably mentioned all this. There are things like the family courts are absolutely weighed down. CAFCAS, an organisation that has to check that everything, all the assessments are right, they're absolutely loaded up to the top with cases. So there is, I keep stressing this, a real big resource problem.
The key question is about it being a children's rights-based approach as opposed to being one that adults are going to be satisfied with. We do need to listen to children, and that has to be our starting point.
Having said that, I would like to not negate the experience of people who've had a difficult time adopting in the UK. I know Cecile has had an experience that was very real, and other people have too. And that seemed to be about length and about paperwork and about intrusiveness. Am I right, Cecile?
Intrusiveness, attitude. I was never welcomed into the offices whenever I had to go to my local authorities. I had to go to the service entrance and sit with the security guard when they came down. We were not treated with respect. We were not at any stage welcomed. Not once was anybody said what you're doing is a positive thing. It was a complete and utter battle.
It's really sad to hear, isn't it? And that's sad that you've had that experience, but I presume that you've used the appeal process, the adoption appeal process and complaints processes to help with that, or certainly would advise you to do that, even though it's retrospect.
And the longer term we're helping other people to come, to understand how it works. You don't know what the whole process. Nobody tells you from the beginning. This is what you're going through. Yeah. It's a complete, as you are in the dark. Yeah. And you also feel powerless as an adoptive parent. You feel powerless, and you're giving your future and everything in the hands of a social worker.
Jabir, a last word from you.
I'm always horrified when you hear about poor practice, and unfortunately the truth of the matter is that there is variable practice from one area to another. But I have to go back to the original point. How is speeding up the process going to impact on any of this? How is focusing on interracial adoption going to make any difference to any of this? The reality is that the political debate that's been generated over the last few days doesn't really address the key issues around adoption, isn't going to lead to more resources being put in place, isn't going to lead to better trained social workers, isn't going to lead to a better outcome for children and young people. And that's what we should really be debating.
So is this really just about political grandstanding?
I fear it is. I fear it's got a lot of very valuable headlines for some people, and is going to do very little to change the lives of those children and young people who need to be adopted or who need to have some stability in their lives.
Well, I totally disagree with that. Basically, I think muddying it with the political issue is taking it away from the needs of the child. And child needs stability. It's the human right to grow up with a family, and it's the only opportunity, I think, adoption that a child will have a normal life.
I would say that there is a genuine desire on the part of this government to improve the adoption process. Unfortunately, politicians being politicians, they also cannot resist the opportunity to make this a far more politicised debate than it should be. Do I have time to say one other thing quite quickly, which is, and I hope Sue will forgive me for saying this, but I do think that there is a tendency, and quite understandable tendency, for the social work profession to be somewhat risk averse, because they get that no one praises them for the 99th time things go right. Everyone latches onto the one time things go wrong. So it's very easy to get a mindset which can be quite negative. So that can become entrenched in thinking it has to be right, it has to be perfect, just so that nothing can go wrong. But I think a very positive step for social workers will be to be able to escape from that risk averse culture, which I think they've become quite embedded in.
I mean, some of the concerns we have are illustrated by the government commissioning work last year by Professor Munro, and social workers praising that because it talks about the child's journey, giving them really good service all the way through their life, etc., etc. One of the big things that came out of that was they needed to really reduce the amount of tick boxes, the amount of bureaucracy, the amount of target setting and measurement. This week it comes out from government that adoptions are going to be measured. The time the teacher local authority takes to find a placement, the time it takes for that process to continue, matching, it's all going to be target setting. What is happening? It's really, really confusing, and I don't think it's, in the interest of children.
Thank you. That's all we've got time for. Thank you to my guests, Gareth Crossman, Director of External Affairs for the Fostering and Adoption Charity TACT, Sue Kent, Professional Officer at the British Association of Social Workers, Cecile Traysenar, who runs the International Adoption Guide, and on the line Jabir Butt, Deputy Chief Executive of the Race Equality Foundation. I'm Alice Lagnado for The Voice of Russia. Goodbye.
Things like...
Can you just, Cecile, explain to listeners what a home study is? Because not everyone is familiar with the term.
Okay, so home study is when you assess to see if you'll make a suitable potential adoptive parent, and it's a social worker who comes to your house over a period of time, roughly about 6 to 9 months, and interviews you and your family members a couple of times for a couple of hours every 3 or 4 weeks, so about 9 to 12 times. So, and then they basically put the papers together. But we had things like documents that weren't signed.
Our Gareth Crossman, Director of External Affairs for the Fostering and Adoption Charity TACT, Sue Kent, Professional Officer at the British Association of Social Workers, Cecile Traysenar, who runs the International Adoption Guide, a comprehensive resource for people who want to adopt from outside the UK, and joining us by phone is Jabir Butt, Deputy Chief Executive of the Race Equality Foundation. I'd like to begin by looking at the issue of speed in all adoptions, and to ask you, Gareth, whether you agree that the adoption process in this country... You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Alice Lagnado. Earlier this month, Prime Minister David Cameron called for the adoption process to be speeded up. The government wants to streamline both the fostering and adoption processes, which they say take too long. Cameron also says that he wants to change what he called the absurd barriers to mixed-race adoption, which he says trap many non-white children in care. To shed some light on the issue of adoption in the UK, with me in the studio...
One of my documents were left in the in-tray at the post office because nobody could go to the post office to post it. That was 2 months.
And Cecile, you tried going through the UK adoption process and in the end were you accepted?
No, I was turned down on an ethnic issue because my father was Dutch and my mother was English, and they would only match me with a half Dutch, half English child, of which there weren't any in the care system.
And so you ended up adopting from another country, Russia, didn't you?
I did, and that was several years later, and that was from another motivation when I...
Should be accelerated.
I think there's certainly merit in the government saying we need to look at the adoption process. Where our concern lies is in the tone that they're using to describe the debate, which is saying, well, if we sort out interracial adoption, then that's the adoption system sorted. So that is one part of a very complex debate. But certainly, as in any system, you can look at it and you can look at room for improvement.
Cecile, what's your view?
Well, I think a lot of improvement can be made on just competence. I'm an adoptive parent, and my whole home study was riddled with incompetence, which took months and months and months.